I'm Clark McLeod at Monarch Research. The presentation you're about to hear is not only entertaining, but will change the lives of many people who experience it. I want to introduce Dr. Doug Tallamy to the thousands of Linn County residents who are planting native trees this season through our Planting Forward program. Our friend and mentor, Dr. Tallamy.
Thank you very much, Clark. Before I start, I want to put what I'm going to talk about into what I call ecological context. Of course, you all know that a year ago in August, you suffered one of the worst natural disasters on record, lost 775,000 trees in Linn and Benton counties. Well, the Monarch Research Project was perfectly positioned to respond to this, and they did with one of the greatest community restoration projects I have ever seen. The very first year, they got 6 companies involved to get plants in the ground. This year alone, 2021, 26,000 free trees to Eastern Iowans. So what I want to do today is tell you why that is such an important effort, why we need these trees, why we need the animals these trees support, why it's not just any old tree that will work, it's got to be the right trees. And finally, we'll talk about what your role as a citizen of Eastern Iowa is in this great restoration project. But before we do that, I want to return to something that happened in the Eastern US anyway. In 2019, we had what we call an oak mast. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. And if the weevils came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they have left the acorn, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants that live, the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils once they leave the acorn. And this is where they will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? It's very simple. That is simply one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns, jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap that acorn beneath the surface of the soil. And the object, of course, is they're going to go back and get it in the wintertime and have something to eat. Well, Jay's memory's not all that good. It reminds me of my own memory. For every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one of them is in the wintertime, which means for every 4 acorns they bury, they're planting 3 new oak trees. And they can bury up to 4,500 acorns per jay each fall. So that's how oaks move around. You won't have the Juanita sphinx moth unless you have the evening primrose on the prairies. This is one of the rare sphinxes on our prairies, very specialized relationships. You won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the large trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that particular bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So without those plants, you don't have the bees. There are at least 13 species of bees in Iowa that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers, for example. Nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over its wonderful view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, we can't leave it as it was because we haven't. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we've grazed it, and of course we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. Why have we done this? I don't know. I suppose we thought the earth, our nest, was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But we were seriously wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our North American bird population already gone. Followed by this one. The UN now predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, so permanently gone, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report headlines like this, as if it's just another headline. They might as well say, well, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. It is not an option to watch the life around us disappear. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from a number of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Well, the great E.O. Wilson, greatest entomologist probably of all times, Harvard emeritus at this point, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects on planet Earth. His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi to do that. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, and that is that that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Here are just a few things that plants do. You know, the ecosystem services are not just for humans, they're for everything out there. Plants are producing oxygen. They're cleaning water, slowing its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use, capturing carbon, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, using the carbon molecule in order to build their tissues, but then they also pump extra carbon into the ground. Our soil scientists now tell us that the soil around us can sequester up to 7 times the total amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now. We just have to get it into the ground, and that's what plants do. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling. So Aldo had a dream. He dreamt that we humans were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things, but he believed that we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems everywhere we went. The notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue today is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not just hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Let's go back to private property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, and that includes ag land, by the way, we're going to fail because we'll be working in areas that are too small and too isolated and too few in order to conserve the amount of nature that we need to run the ecosystems we all depend on. Now, when I use the word conservation, I don't mean We're just going to conserve what's not already destroyed. We do need to do that, but we need to actually restore what we have destroyed. In order to rebuild an ecosystem, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute equally to ecosystem function. So we have to start with the most important groups, and there are two groups we can't do without. One would be the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. These plants are capturing most of the energy from the sun and turning it into food, which they then store in their tissues, mostly in their leaves. Well, if you don't move that energy from plants to animals, then you don't have any animals and you don't have a functional ecosystem. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates that eat plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and most of the insects that are passing energy on to other animals are, in fact, caterpillars. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we're reconstructing ecosystems, if they don't include a lot of caterpillars, there will be failed food webs, and you won't have succeeded. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So something special about caterpillars, let's talk briefly about what it might be. There's actually several things special about caterpillars that are at least important to birds, and one of them is that caterpillars are soft. They are nutritious, they're very high in fat, very high in protein, have a low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly compared to beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges as well. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets, they're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. So if we want birds in our life, if we want all the things that eat insects that I'm not talking about, and we do because that's what runs our ecosystems, we have to start landscaping in a way that creates these insects, that supports them. It's a different goal. And now we want pretty landscapes that are living landscapes. How do we do that? How do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? We do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. It seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which ones we choose. Most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are highly specialized on particular plants. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. And that's why when you take milkweeds out of your yard, they're not going to start eating your crepe myrtle or your grass or anything else. They can't do it. So what's their alternative? They disappear. And that's exactly what we've seen with the monarch. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild ecosystems, we can't do it without having the organisms within that ecosystem that run that ecosystem, which means you need a functional food web, and only particular plants will create that food web. You know, and I hear people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oaks when they're 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oaks are doing, particularly for your local food web, you can enjoy them the very first year. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they're free, by the way. And immediately they started to attract the moths that run the food web at our house by bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patched smoky moth, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a Crocus geometer, a moth standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. So they start to contribute to your food web immediately. All right, there are 4 things that we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area that we have in lawn. We have more than 40 million acres nationwide in lawn, and that's a 2005 statistic. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of lawn, but I am suggesting we cut the area of lawn in half. We can replant 20 million acres. And if we do this at home, we can create a new national park that we call Homegrown National Park. Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a piece of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to interact with nature, to build a personal relationship with the natural world at your own pace, your own time. All you have to do is go outside. Why is that so important? Because they need that personal relationship with the natural world, because they are going to be the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what they're stewarding, why they're stewarding it, and if they don't love stewarding it, they're going to be lousy stewards. Go to homegrownnationalpark.org and put in your data. Your little firefly will light up on the map. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that used to be lawn? Some of them, at least, have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Well, it turns out that there are just a few of our native plants that are doing most of the work. They're the keystones. If we take them out of our food webs, the food webs collapse. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. That's how powerful a keystone plant is in your yard. Imagine what would happen if we took oaks and other keystone plants out of the system. Diversity would crash. So how do you find out what the keystone plants are for your county? Anywhere in the country, you go to National Wildlife Federation website, Native Plant Finder, and put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. They're critically important. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of natives that aren't contributing all that much either. That's what I mean when I say not all trees are equal. Some are really important. And what's the most important tree in the nation? It's one of the oaks, the genus Quercus. In 84% of the counties in which they occur, they are the #1 keystone plant in terms of supporting caterpillars. 275 species of caterpillars in Lynn County alone, which is 20% of all the caterpillars that occur in the entire state of Iowa on that single type of plant, oaks. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out now, which is demonstrating very conclusively that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines. These are all the ways that lights kill insects. But I know what you're going to say. I cannot turn that light out over my garage because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to particularly night flying moths. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs in our security lights, overnight we would save billions of insects and billions of dollars too, because the LEDs, of course, are a lot more energy efficient. Okay, there are the fourth thing we need to do in order to help those caterpillars that are running our food webs is to landscape in a way that allows them to complete their development. I guarantee they will do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree, then you have a layered landscape. Maybe a dogwood here, a native azalea, ferns, ground cover. This is a safe site. The caterpillars drop down, the soil's not compacted, they can pupate, they can spin their cocoon. They're not going to be mowed, they're not going to be trampled. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink your lawn. You put plants around your trees, not lawn, and it becomes a safe site for those caterpillars. So we can do a whole lot better in terms of promoting caterpillar well-being by thinking about the way we landscape. But remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. Get these native plants back into the landscape and the food webs will be sustainable. You know, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And somehow, the first one is that we've come to think that nature's optional. We like it. It's nice to have around, but it's not essential. It's not necessary. And that means, of course, when resources are in short supply, when push comes to shove, which is always, nature takes a back seat. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this, but by restricting conservation efforts just to areas where we don't have a lot of humans, we've condemned them to failure because those areas are too few, too small, and too isolated. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. Somehow we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. We all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, so many of us feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink their lawn. One person can use Keystone Plants. One person can remove the invasive species on their property. We didn't have a chance to talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can totally revitalize the property that he or she owns. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about your little piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you're going to start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, all understaffed. They'll love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power. And we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and ultimately our own. So I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.